Hey guys, Chris here. Tonight we have a story about a park ranger who worked in Yellowstone National Park for several decades. And towards the end of his career, he finally started talking about what he really saw in Yellowstone. That's next. We also have a couple of stories, one from some campers in Yellowstone as well as Grand Teton National Park. So with that, we're going to get into our beer, and our beer tonight is Founders All Day IPA. That is a very national park looking type of beer. It's got the Scout International on it and with a canoe on top. That's great. And this says it's refreshing and easy drinking. And that is a session IPA. It says citrusy, crisp, and refreshing. So we're going to crack that and see what we got here. Oh. Little sudsy. A little in the can there. Ooh, it's very, very blonde looking there. Look at that. I'm going to take it right out of the can there. Wow, that is very flavorful. Almost champagne-y. Smooth finish, almost a little dry though at the end. Hence the champagne. Wow. And that's a 4.7 ABV. And then there's a little bit of a bitter linger, like well after you've swallowed it. Interesting. All right, Founders All Day IPA. Cheers. Okay guys, I wanted to start out by saying I used to work in Yellowstone National Park, located in northwest Wyoming. It goes into Montana and Idaho. 2.2 million acres of geothermal features, including geysers, hot springs, mud pots, and steam vents. An amazing wilderness of mountains, valleys, rivers, and lakes, and wildlife rich, including grizzly bears, wolves, elk, moose, and bison. Just an incredible place. And I worked there in 1983, 84, and 86 while I was in college. During my summer breaks, I would go out to Yellowstone. And so these stories from this park ranger, I've been to many of these locations that he talks about. And I worked in Canyon Village for the concessionaire there, Hamilton Stores. And I worked as a cook for the Fountain and Grill, the soda fountain. Really cool place. And we would go backpacking every weekend, fly fishing, camping, and got to talk to a lot of tourists that came out there. It was a great experience for me. And so the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, which was the main feature at Canyon Village, is where the lower falls is, 308 feet, and it goes into the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. And it's called the Grand Canyon because it's this immense 1,000+ foot deep canyon, and this Yellowstone that's in this canyon for 24 miles. And that's where they got the name Yellowstone. It was from the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. Just an amazing place, and I got to work there all 3 summers. Now this park ranger's name was Bob Jackson. He worked in Yellowstone as a backcountry ranger for over 30 years. He logged well over 50,000 miles of travel in Yellowstone's backcountry over those decades. He was known as Action Jackson because he was a famous ranger who would go after poachers on horseback. And he had a rifle, I believe it was a 30-06. And he would regularly patrol the backcountry and he was famous for patrolling the Thoroughfare region, which is the southeast corner around Yellowstone Lake. Really high alpine lake, extremely large lake, and he would go after poachers and patrol and keep an eye on things for the Park Service. He spent a lot of time in the backcountry. So if anybody knew the wildlife in the backcountry of Yellowstone, it was Bob Jackson. So back in the late 1970s, this was the first time Bob had heard something in the backcountry that he couldn't identify. He was up patrolling in the backcountry on horseback, the Fan Creek drainage, which is in the northwest part of the park in the Gallatin Range, which runs north and south, and he was on a tributary of the Gallatin River, which has 191, Highway 191, which runs north into Montana, to Big Sky, Montana. He was well back in the backcountry in the Fan Creek drainage, and he heard late at night this extremely loud and long howl scream that was about a mile away in this valley that he was in. And he said this sound filled up this valley, and he said it sounded like 1,000 elk going to their death. It was extremely frightening, and he said this was not wolves, coyotes, or elk. He had no idea what it was. And he was amazed that something could have this much capacity to produce this amount of volume for this long. It was well over a minute that it had this loud howl scream. And this was the first time he had ever heard anything like that in the backcountry of Yellowstone. 2 weeks later, Bob was on horseback with a pack string and 2 other park employees, and they were 11 miles back up the Fan Creek drainage, up Sportsman's Creek, heading towards Sportsman's Lake. They had come down this steep slope, and there was a subalpine meadow in front of them, and they could see these thickets or stands of trees that were about 20 yards wide or so, and each one had like this center tree, and then around it was these smaller trees. I'm assuming the main tree would drop the pine cones, and over time they would grow these smaller trees. The horses were acting agitated with their nostrils flaring, and they were snorting. Again, there was a pack train behind him, and he took all of his effort to hold the horses and look around, and he was expecting to see a grizzly bear somewhere around him, and he had good clearance and he couldn't see anything. And so he looked down into this meadow. He was about 40 or 50 yards above this meadow, and he saw this deer come shooting out of this thicket of trees, running for its life. Full tilt, running through this meadow, and immediately right after this, he saw this large, black, shaggy form, this shape on 2 legs, running after this deer. And then this deer disappeared into one of these thickets, and this large shape went into the thicket, and it came out the other side, and it immediately angled perpendicular to the next thicket in this meadow. And Bob said this thing was running really fast, and he could see it for the first 10 steps or so, and it had this flat face, very dark face, and it was running with these arms swinging, these straight arms swinging like this for momentum, and the arms were not cocked back like humans do. When we run like this. And this thing went from tree thicket, tree stand to tree stand, and he was amazed that it was choosing cover and protection as it fled. Like it was really smart. And bears, he noticed, never did that. They would always run in a straight line away from him whenever he encountered a bear in the backcountry, and he encountered a lot of bears. He said this thing was over 6 feet tall, really bulky, stocky, large shoulders, and it was running very quickly, and it appeared to be fleeing from him, like it didn't want to be seen by him. It was doing everything it could to not be seen. He did not know what happened to this deer, but he tied this in with what he had heard 2 weeks earlier on the other side of this drainage in the Fan Creek area. Back in the mid-1980s, this was winter, December, Ranger Bob was on patrol in the southeast corner of the park with 3 other park rangers, and they were on skis. They were heading from the main highway that comes up from the Grand Tetons in the southern part of the park, the south entrance, and they were heading straight east from the highway towards Heart Lake. They were going to go about 5 or 6 miles to get to this Heart Lake. There was about 3.5 feet of snow on the ground at this time. It was an overcast day, and there was snow in the forecast. Now this area back then was not known to have people go back there. It's just too remote, it's too hard to get to, especially in winter. So Bob and these 3 other rangers were heading east towards the lake. About halfway through, before they got to the lake, they came around this corner and they could see to their right, coming from the trees and then coming straight from the south, it appeared to be tracks heading straight across their route and then heading north in the snow. And they could see the stride was really long on these tracks. As they got closer, they saw that it was about 5.5 to 6 feet wide on this stride, coming from the south, heading north. They're heading straight east. As they got closer, Bob said he stopped and they looked down and they could see one of the footprints. It was a human-like footprint, deep in the snow. 3.5 feet was almost all the way down to the bottom. They could see toe prints in this. It was about 18 inches long. They immediately started talking about it, and they knew this was not a bear and any other animal, and they immediately had the creeps. This spooky feeling came over them. They continued on, and they made their camp. They didn't have any other encounters or anything else happen. But Bob said this was the first and only time he'd ever found footprints in the backcountry of Yellowstone. Now, because of these experiences and the sighting that he had, Bob kept his ear open, and over time, he had talked to other people in and around the park, Yellowstone. And he talked to outfitters and guides, backcountry guides, and they had their own stories about sounds they heard and footprints they found, and even sightings that they've had in and around Yellowstone National Park. And so that brings us to our next story, which is about 2 campers, 2 backcountry backpackers who went to this lake that I went to back in 1983. So this next story takes place at a lake that I've been to in Yellowstone and fished there, backpacked there, called Grebe Lake. And Grebe Lake is about 5 miles west of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, and as you're heading west towards north, and about halfway there, there's the trailhead to this Grebe Lake, and this lake is known for having Arctic grayling, which are primarily found in the Arctic and in a lot of places in Canada, and just a few drainages in the Rockies, up the Yellowstone drainage in the upper Missouri. And so in 1983 and 1984, I visited this lake with my good friends, and we backpacked in, and we camped, and we caught Arctic grayling, had a great time. We didn't hear anything strange or anything weird. And in fact, one night, we had the tents all set up, had this camp. It was in the grass. It had rained that day and a little bit that evening. Woke up the next morning, next to my tent was a large grizzly bear footprint, just 12 inches from the tent. And this is where I was sleeping, and my future wife was with me as well. And what that means is there was a grizzly bear moving around the campsite that night. Really scary when you're in occupied grizzly bear habitat. Interesting now, we woke up, we saw this large footprint. It was kind of misty that morning. We all went down to the lake, had some coffee, hanging out, and about an hour later we came back to the tents to get ready for the day, and a moose had come by through the camp and stepped perfectly on this grizzly bear footprint. Really strange. Shows how much wildlife there is in the park. So this story takes place in 1980, just a few years before I was there. Two brothers, Steve and Brad, from up in Montana, wanted to go down to Yellowstone and go fishing in the park for the weekend. And they heard there was Arctic grayling in this Grebe Lake. So they drive down through the park, get to the trailhead, get their backpacks on, got their fishing gear. They're excited. They're going to go for just a couple nights. They go the 5 miles through the thick lodgepole forest to this Grebe Lake. It's fairly flat to get to the lake. And then there's some mountains around it. Observation Peak is to the north of it, behind it. They set up their camp, and both of them went out fishing for the day, for the rest of the afternoon and into the early evening. And Brad came back to camp, just wanted to hang out. He was done. And Steve kept fishing until just before nightfall. And then he comes back, and it was dark by the time he got back to camp. They had a campfire, had dinner, and they noticed nothing strange, nothing odd going on. And so they were just having a great time. It was exactly what they wanted to do, was catch some fish, and they caught some Arctic grayling. Retired to their tent. They had one tent that they shared, pretty small tent, one opening, really low to the ground on the sides. And they're sitting in their tent about 10 o'clock at night. They had a lantern going, I believe it was a battery operated lantern. They're talking, they're half falling asleep, they're talking about the next day. And they're laying there, and suddenly they heard something from the north of them, out of the trees, come running straight for their tent. And it was getting louder and louder. And right away they noticed it sounded really heavy, really large. And it was getting closer, and then it came running just right up to the tent, and then it just kept going, heading for the lake to the south of them. And then they could hear these footsteps just fade out, and then it was quiet. They sat up and they stared at each other in disbelief. And they both had these really wide eyes. And they could hear it was really quiet, and they're waiting and listening. And then they started slowly talking about it, and they said, that was no bear, moose, or elk. It was on 2 feet. They could clearly hear that it was on 2 feet, and it sounded too heavy to be a man. And it had this jogging type rhythm as it came by, and these really loud footsteps in the dirt. They sat up most of the rest of the night, could not sleep, got out of their tents the next morning, immediately got out and started looking around for footprints. They didn't see anything. It hadn't rained the night before or anything, so the ground was pretty solid. They packed up and left. I don't know if they came back. It's really interesting. Sometimes these encounters are so simple. I mean, this only lasted 10 seconds. They heard something for 10 seconds. But it could only point to one thing, which was a Bigfoot, because there was nothing else that would explain this. Now, south of Yellowstone National Park is Grand Teton National Park, and it's just a couple miles south of Yellowstone, and it's connected by the John D. Rockefeller Parkway. And the Teton Range is just an amazing place. You have the 13,770 foot tall Grand Teton on this jagged mountain range with Jackson Hole below it, this very flat valley. Just very iconic western mountain range. And this is where Gary and his grandfather and grandmother and uncle, they were RVing through the park, and they were heading on their way to Yellowstone. While they were in Jackson Hole in the Tetons, the weather changed on them and it started snowing when they were at Jackson Lake. And so they decided it was best to get into the nearest campground and spend the night and see how this thing played out. So they went to one of the campgrounds and let the snowstorm kind of go through, and they were very grateful. They had their RV, it was nice and warm, they had all their food, it was self-contained. They're in this campground. There was only 2 other campers in this large campground. It was June 12th, 2000. And in Montana, Wyoming, late spring, early summer, you can still get snow. And that's what they got. So they're in their RV that night on June 12th. Had dinner, enjoying each other's company, had the heater going. They're talking about heading north and getting into the park, Yellowstone, and doing the upper and lower loop, and looking forward to the weather getting better for them. And the snow stopped and it turned to this light drizzle. Almost a mist. They were sound asleep, and the family dog that they brought with them started barking, and barking violently, is what Gary said. Very frightening just to hear your dog going crazy in the middle of the night. Gary immediately sat up, and he was in the upper part of the RV, and he had a bed with a window behind him, and he looks out the window, doesn't see anything. Looks out the back of the camper opposite of the door and looks towards the rest of the campground, doesn't see anything there, and he can smell something from outside in the RV, and it smells this horrible stench. Right away, the grandfather and the grandmother, they got up too, and they were saying, what's going on? What's going on? And the aunt and uncle, they woke up too. It was just a lot of commotion going on. And then Gary slides open the window, the curtain, and looks towards their picnic table. And he saw, and they all saw, this large dark shape standing there, not 10 feet away next to this pine tree. And whatever this thing was, it was reaching up into this pine tree. It was doing something in the pine tree, because they could see the bough of this pine tree moving like this. And they're all staring in amazement, not sure what they're even looking at. The dog is still barking. This thing suddenly turns and looks right at them. Now it's dark, but because of the snow on the ground, they can clearly see the shape of this thing, and they can clearly see that it's 7 feet tall, 4 foot wide shoulders, and this small conical head with this hairy face, and it did not have a snout on it. And it was standing there staring straight at them, again, 10 feet away into the RV, and the RV was dark. They were all frozen, looking out the window, and this thing suddenly turns and starts running off north of the campground towards the trees. And it had these really long strides that was taking to get to the campground. And then it was gone. They were terrified. It was not a bear, it was not a grizzly bear, it was not a person. Just having this experience all together with no help, there was no rangers around, there was nobody. And they didn't know if this thing was going to circle around, come back, come up from the other side of the camper. They had no idea. After about 5 minutes, the dog quieted down. The smell, the stench that they all smelled went away. And they waited. And they listened and they continued to look out the window. They didn't dare turn the lights on. And they had this feeling of terror, which was, you don't always feel that on an everyday basis. They got through the night. Next morning, Gary and his uncle were the first to go out, and they went over to this tree, and they saw below this tree footprints still in the snow. And large footprints, they were huge, and they could see them heading off through the campground. So they followed them into the next campsite, crossed the road, and then they lost them as it went into the forest, and they couldn't find where they went. It was too thick in there. They came back, told the grandmother and grandfather and the aunt what they'd seen, and then they all came out and they were looking at these tracks, and they realized they had to have been seeing a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot in the Grand Teton National Park. And they decided this was their day to leave. They needed to get out of there, and they just didn't want to do this again. So they headed up to the park, to Yellowstone, and they cut their trip kind of short because they didn't want to spend any more time in either of the two parks. And that is our story from Grand Teton National Park. Now there's this family that was up in Yellowstone, and they asked one of the park rangers his recommendations on some sites to go see. And he said, well, there's this really cool tall cliff called Poison Cliff. You want to know why it's called that? Because one drop will kill you. And what that means is, as beautiful as our national parks are, they can be a very dangerous place if you're not careful. So always remember that. All right, you guys. Thank you for watching my channel. Thank you for your comments. They're always very encouraging for me. I work very hard in these videos and what I do here, and I really appreciate the encouragement that I get from you guys. So if you guys like what I do, if you like stories about the strange, unexplained, and things that go bump in the night, please like and subscribe. That always helps my channel. And we will see you on the next one. As always, keep hiking.